First thing you do when you find yourself in a hole is you stop digging.
Well, that's thing 1, but what is thing 2?
We'll find out how the leaders of tomorrow think we can get out of this mess next.
Calling, 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 calling. Call a growth buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Well, here you are in the Growth Busters podcast about coming to terms with the limits to growth. In this podcast, we roast the growth pushers and toast the transition towns, degrowthers, steady-staters, child-free, and others who get that there are limits to growth and small is beautiful. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth, and founder and chief scientist here at the Institute for Advanced Growth Addiction Studies.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, Growth Busters advisor, environmental law and policy buff, and lover of all things sustainable energy. You'll find us at growthbusters.org. Search for Growth Busters on Facebook, Twitter, groups.io, and of course your podcast app for the latest growth busting news.
And this is going to be an interesting episode. It's becoming kind of an annual tradition, Stephanie, where we hear from college students. You are probably expecting part 2 of our conversation with Nandita Bajaj, Sarah Bexell, and Paul Sutton. The first part of this series was called Overpopulation Think Tank, Part 1. So who wouldn't think we would have Part 2 next?
Yeah, that would be the logical way to go.
Well, surprise, surprise. We're throwing this in real quick because we really want to get this episode turned around fast while the students that I spoke with are still in school. So stay tuned. Very soon we'll come up with Part 2 of the Overpopulation Think Tank. And I want to say that, young adults in their 20s today will be the leaders of tomorrow. I wish they could be the leaders today because we need dramatic action to get out of this hole that we've dug ourselves into. And I'm impressed that the leaders of tomorrow have remarkable awareness of the emergency that we face. And I think you'll find they have some interesting ideas.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you are interjecting this conversation today, especially because the think tank are the folks that have taught these students. And so there's a lot of things in common there.
Yeah. And speaking of teaching students, I want to mention that if you're an educator listening to this episode, we do have something called the Growth Busters Campus Tour, where we offer you a pretty amazing array of kind of a speakers bureau, some of the leading thinkers on the planet about issues related to sustainability and growth. If you head over to growthbusters.org/campus-tour, you can learn more about it. And this might be a good time to plan for a speaker in the summer, if you're teaching a summer course, or go ahead and get somebody on the schedule for the fall so you can relax during the summer. Okay, so about once a year, we do get an invitation to sit down with Paul Sutton's ecological economics class at University of Denver to record a conversation for the Growth Busters podcast, and it's that time again. The last conversation we had a little over a year ago, you can find and listen to. It's What Do College Students Think Their Future Holds? I think that's episode 65. We will put a link in the show notes to make it easy for you to find. So today, we're going to share the latest conversation. I recorded it with students just a week ago. One thing we hope to gain from this is a sense of how knowledge and perceptions have changed in just a year. And since this is an ecological economics class and it's near the end of the semester, I did assume some familiarity with the concepts of overshoot, carrying capacity, ecological footprint, etc. Now, if you're new to the podcast and you aren't familiar with these concepts, go back and listen to the Growth Busters podcast episode titled Overshoot, World's Best Introduction. We'll put a link in the show notes there too. But again, since I assumed a decent level of overshoot literacy among these students, I wanted to explore not necessarily their awareness, but what they think might be the pathway out of overshoot. And in the process, of course, I discovered 100% awareness, very well educated about this.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Stephanie, you couldn't join us. Stephanie is on the East Coast, and this conversation took place in a classroom in Denver, so I was the lucky candidate for that.
Yep, you were repping Growth Busters for us.
Maybe if we plan ahead enough, maybe we can get you to do the next one, because I think it'd be really cool for them to have somebody who's not quite so ancient sitting at the table with them.
Yeah, that'd be a great idea.
All right. Well, let's play that conversation. And then at the other end, I'm anxious to get your take on that conversation, Steph.
Sounds great. Let's listen.
I want to read some highlights from a news story that I saw it was in the Denver Post up here and the Gazette in Colorado Springs just a couple of days ago. The headline was, Colorado State demographer, slower population growth could pose workforce challenges. Colorado's population growth has slowed as many people reach retirement age and fewer babies are born, the state's demographer said Thursday, warning its economic future will hinge on its ability to maintain its workforce. Here's a quote, "We can't waste a person. We're going to need them more and more," said Elizabeth Garner, the Colorado State demographer, speaking at the Adams County Regional Economic Partnership's State of the Region event. Not quoting anymore. "Much of Colorado's economic future will be dependent on its population, which is growing at a slowing rate despite the popular narrative that the state is seeing exponential growth," Garner said, but not quotes. In 2007, both the United States and Colorado saw their peak birth rates in 2007. But in the past decade, the population under the age of 18 has declined by more than 1 million people, Garner said. With most of Colorado's growth being people over age 65, the state's economic future may face some workforce challenges, she said. Quoting Garner, "How do we add people to the labor force? Really start looking at those under 25 and looking at those over 55, looking at our people of color, looking at people with disabilities, looking at the formerly incarcerated. All can increase that labor force. Boosting Colorado's economy relies on boosting its workforce," Governor Jared Polis said. So, what's remarkable about the highlights I read from that story? What kind of stood out to you and why?
I think it's interesting that the focus of the article is losing workers. I feel like that's a common point of discussion with the aging population. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's definitely concerning that there's like such a disparity between the amount of young people in quotes versus old people in quotes. Yeah, I just don't know if it's always useful to look at or rely on young people being like the ones who are going to boost the economy and looking to them like you need to help us by working and producing some sort of, economic growth for, in this case, Colorado.
Thanks, Elsa. Who else?
I also thought it was kind of interesting that they're effectively treating young people as tokens. There's no discussion about why the birth rate has since not peaked because no one can afford to have children, or why, quote unquote, nobody wants to work.
Yeah.
Even though there are jobs out there, the point is if you cannot survive to be a member of that workforce, I don't know, just treating people like tokens with no regard for welfare seems a bit callous.
Yeah, it's like, what is your value? Your value is as a factor of labor. Yeah. One thing I find interesting, is if the population isn't growing as fast, and eventually it's going to shrink here in Colorado, not for a while apparently, but that means that the number of people whose needs have to be met by the economy isn't growing as fast either, right? Doesn't it seem like it's disconnected from reality that the economy is here to meet our needs? So it just needs to match how many of us there are. I just thought this was a really great example of some of the insanity that we're faced with day after day. Let me just change the subject dramatically, though. I'd like to know what you guys think the American dream is. What's the American dream?
I think it's seen as this, idealized vision that you should be able to come to the United States and be able to work and, put in the hours to better yourself and be able to have, a good life, because those things are supposed to be available to you in the United States. That's, the idealized, what you hope for, I guess, with coming to the United States.
Yeah, I think it's very much like rags to riches. Like anybody can just make a living no matter what their background is. And I think that's just like the generalized American dream.
Okay, so far we have a good life and making a living. Jordy, it looked like you had something to say.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because I think there's a distinction to be made between what the American dream traditionally was supposed to be and what it's kind of been turned into. Because initially you have kind of this cultural aspect of it's supposed to be the understanding of whatever factors and limitations you faced elsewhere don't apply here, and that your success, your ability to get where you want to be in life is dependent entirely on your own work. Kind of that whole conceptualized American freedom, American individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I think it has kind of been turned into almost, patriotism isn't quite the right word, but hyper-nationalism, where there is no longer a sense of community. They took the pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you can do anything to absolve themselves of the responsibility of being part of a society. So if you're failing, that's your fault. And so you get all these people who quote the American dream as like, oh, you're poor, you chose to be poor. And just kind of using it as a scapegoat to ignore systematic issues.
That's interesting, because when I was growing up, it was a little different. I think it was this sense really of entitlement. It was that automatically each generation was going to be better off than the generation before, that you couldn't help it. It was just built into the system. It was assumed that I was going to make more money than my parents did, and sure enough, I did. Kind of sad that how much money you make is the measure of having a better life, but that was really a big part of it. But there were these assumptions that it was going to be easy for the next generation because it was just progress. And it's interesting that I don't think any of you really put that into your definition today. I'm not too surprised, because I think you probably realize what? You're not being handed anything, are you?
Not really.
I haven't really thought about it in terms of expecting that my generation or the future generations will have it better off, because that's never been a belief of mine. Like, I don't think I've ever considered that, because I've just grown up with constant input of we are going to be worse off and everyone after us is going to be worse off. And I think that's specifically because of environmental degradation, which has been coupled with so many other issues. I mean, there's a lot of political instability. There's always been a lot of political instability, I guess, if you put it in terms of, I don't know, the grand scheme of all of the United States history. There's never really been a great time to be an American unless you're a very specific demographic. But I've never looked to the future and had a whole lot of expectation of making more money or being more successful than my parents. But I also think that it's important for our generation to maybe shift the definition of success. As, you know, I think a lot of people these days, especially young people, are kind of like, I don't really care how much money I make as long as I can, you know, make a living for myself, like pay the bills and do the fun things I like to do, while also hopefully, you know, paving a future for other generations that is better than ours. I would hope that that's kind of the goal, at least. It's one of my goals.
Yeah, I wanted to give a sort of a different perspective here. Jordy, what you were saying about like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, I think that it's a very generational thing versus, you know, the people that are running it now, or, you know, the older generation. But I've noticed that in college, the younger people have a much different idea of what the American dream might be. So I don't know, I almost think that in the next 20, 30 years, that those ideals of pull yourself up by your bootstraps are going to change a lot, and that it'll be more of a lend a hand kind of thing, almost. rather than just an individualistic approach to the American dream.
It's easy to just call it the American dream because everybody sort of knows roughly what we're talking about, but maybe we can, at this table, redefine it. But I hate to call it the American dream because it shouldn't just be unique to people in America, right?
Bingo.
Yeah. So I don't know if we can come up with another name. Maybe we should just call it the dream. But if you have a better name for it, speak up. But let's redefine it. What should the dream be, you think?
The global dream, or like the human dream, maybe connecting us, taking the separation out of the term itself, taking the nationalistic separation, and maybe thinking on a larger scale, what does humanity hope for? What are we dreaming about as a group of people on this planet?
And I mean, I think going along with like what you were talking about earlier with like just the environmental issues we're going to face, that's not unique to the United States. All of that is going to be, it's affecting everybody, and it's going to require a solution from everyone and everyone working together. So I think the more that we can break down those nationalistic barriers and just actually work together and acknowledge just that the human existence like is tough and that, we need to be able to support each other is better than trying to separate and say that you'll be better off in one place than another.
Yeah, I think exactly that. Kind of going away from that individualist aspect and breaking down those barriers and making it social, because we're a social species. None of these problems are individual, and at least to me, I've always received the American dream as a purely individual thing. It's interesting that you mentioned how for you it was generational. It was the expectation that future generations automatically receive an improvement in life from their predecessors. But I've always kind of heard it to be just me, I. And I think actually kind of a return to that, because I feel like all we've ever been handed are the previous generation's mistakes. So it would be nice to focus it less around what we can make for ourselves and what we can do for each other and for our future.
It sounds like you guys are pretty focused on solving problems rather than just having a good life. Is that because the state of the world is that there's problems that need to be solved, or you won't have a good life?
Yeah.
So what's the goal? I want to talk about this problem solving for sure, but let's go back to the dream. What is the goal? What's the good life? If we can solve these problems, what will a good life look like for you?
Well, I think that, so kind of back to what I was saying before about what Jordy was saying about the older generation kind of being more pull yourself up by your bootstraps versus more college students are more lend a hand. I think, I'll be honest, I think that both sides that I've seen are such an extreme. I personally believe that we got to find kind of a middle ground between those two approaches. It's just crazy to see what a college student believes in versus what their parent believes in is the absolute polar opposite, just between one generation. And I think that it's going to be very hard to find that middle ground, but I do believe it's possible.
What are those opposites? The individualism versus the cooperation?
Yeah, I'll say this in the lightest way possible. I believe that the older generations are very individualistic, capitalist-based, versus I've seen college students more towards like and I mean this in the absolute lightest way possible, like communist, socialist type area. And I believe that those are obviously two very extremely different views. So I think a middle ground is kind of somewhere where we need to be.
Yeah, I think some of the middle ground, at least this is me just connecting the dots between kind of what the points that you're making about the polar opposites. I think a middle ground is kind of, I would hope that this would be an inherent assumption, but that people value themselves and think of themselves as significant to the greater picture. I mean, I think we're all, not to be like kind of woo-woo, but we're all like little puzzle pieces that are part of a greater puzzle that we're all trying to put together. So, I mean, I think not in a selfish way, but thinking about yourself and making sure that you are, you know, equipped and have a foundation for yourself to be able to give. I don't think that there is much you can offer your community unless you are stabilized yourself. But I think it's really hard to have a sense of community right now because a lot of people don't really see themselves in the greater picture or don't really feel like they have the resources to be secure in themselves. So I think the collective goal is like offering individuals resources so that they can be a part of the collective. And those two pieces kind of have to work symbiotically. You know, you need a community for individuals to thrive, and individuals need to thrive for a community to thrive.
I don't remember what it was we were talking about in class, but you had brought up kind of almost this idea of trust between parties, particularly in terms of economics and trusting each other to do the right thing, and that largely that is not the case. So I think it might have been like with the farmers and the water pollution and then the indirect effects.
It's the prisoner's dilemma is one of
Yeah.
the key ways to communicate the trust issue. And trust in institutions is at the lowest level right now.
Yeah.
We don't trust corporations. We don't trust government. We don't trust each other. We don't trust the police. I mean, we have a real problem with trust. And to touch upon what Elsa was saying, communities depend on trust.
Exactly.
That's the voice of Paul Sutton, the professor in the class, just so listeners will know. Go ahead. You had more to say, Jordy?
Yeah, I think kind of exactly what you said. That is the basis of being a functional part of a community. You have to trust, A, that the community can take care of you, because even just from a biologic living organism point of view, your first priority will always be your own survival. Even if you care about others, you won't be able to do anything else if you aren't assured of your own stability. So being able to trust that the community will support you, and then if you can't trust that, then you won't be a supportive part of the community, and it's just this horrible positive feedback loop of nobody trusts each other. So I feel like there needs to be some leap of faith towards, even if other people won't reciprocate, someone needs to take the first step towards making this goal a reality, because if no one does that, then we're all just talking and doing nothing.
Bunch of bystanders.
I think I see in higher education right now, because that's where I am. I mean, that's kind of the scope of my worldview right now, or at least the focus is young people are motivated enough that they are making those steps. I mean, simply by, I think most people in this room are studying environmental science, sustainability, geography, you know, anything along those lines. And if you're not, that's totally fine. But I think that generally people in higher education are taking the steps by trying to educate themselves, having these types of conversations and building those foundations so that we have a large community of people who are motivated to work together. So I think I see those first steps being made, which I think is important and gives me hope.
I think it's really admirable that when I've asked you to help us figure out what is the good life, that so far all of your comments have been about community and doing the right thing. And so far no one has said anything that's just kind of specific to them. But I'm sure I want to give you permission to talk about those too. You know, what's important to you in your life 10 years from now? What do you need? Is it a great job, a fancy car,
Private jet.
Married, 6 kids, just a great career, meaningful life? What's important to you for your future, besides having a planet that isn't dead?
Honestly, I would say, like, something as simple as just not even really having like a full family or anything, but just like living in an apartment, being on my own, maybe helping my parents out as they get into their old ages, stuff like that. You know, nothing like what a lot of people in the past might say, like, oh, I want a mansion and a fancy car, and I want all this, I want all that. I think people want things kind of simpler nowadays, and that's what I've come to see, and that's kind of what I want as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like it's moved more away from, like, where before you would have said, I want to come out of college and find a job and just make the most money I can. I think a lot of people have reached this point where it's like, I just want a livable wage, like where I can support myself and don't feel like I'm struggling. And like, for me, the dream would be that it's past a livable wage where I'm making enough that I can also try and support my community and better the people around me, because I don't know. I feel like that's all we can do. Like,
that's enough of a reach, isn't it?
Yeah, like, I don't know. I feel like we've hit a point, especially with higher education, where it gets more and more expensive, but the jobs aren't paying more. So you're kind of just looking for that middle ground where you can support yourself and hopefully have enough that you can also support the people around you.
I think it's kind of, in that vein, largely moving away from materialism in terms of goals, because like the things you initially came up with were mansion, fancy car, private jet.
Yep.
But then the things people our age want are life experiences and the ability to live comfortably in a way that does not induce existential anxiety, I think. And I know, at least for me, demographically, before we even get to livable wage, before we get to I'd like to be able to own a house and not just rent for the rest of my life, part of that, for me, demographically, is social, because what I would like is to be able to live in a country, in a community where I feel safe to exist. Like, sure, I can get a job and make money, but if I can't feel safe going to a mall, what's that worth?
I hear you.
Yeah, not to be depressing. I mean, it's hard not to. But none of that even matters if we don't have clean water and clean air. Like, and those are things that I'm concerned about having in the next 20 years. Like, just like the fundamentals of, I don't know, whatever that pyramid is of like the hierarchy of needs, is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, some of the foundations of that are like clean water, clean air, access to food, housing. Sometimes is debatable, which I don't understand why it is, because it shouldn't be debatable. Everyone should have some sort of structure over their heads, whether that's a tent, a van, or a house. I mean, that would be awesome. Being able to have clean water and clean air is currently like up for debate. Like, we don't know if we're going to have that. And I just recently watched The Lorax, and I thought about, I don't know, there's some really big themes in The Lorax. If you guys haven't seen it, or rewatching it as an adult is very valuable, I think. I don't know, every water or air is a commodity, and I think we're kind of coming into an era where air is like might be kind of a commodity, which is concerning. And I don't really care about getting a job if I can't breathe. So I hope that we can, I don't know, have clean air. Yeah.
Elsa, it sounds like that's what keeps you up at night.
Sometimes. I'm a pretty good sleeper, though. I'm really tired at the end of the day, usually.
What about the rest of you? What keeps you up at night? Is that it, or is it something else?
I mean, I think that's kind of the base of it, because at least for me, anything that I'm worried about or afraid of for myself, for the world, stems from being able to keep the world a livable place. And, like, can you breathe? Can you drink water without having to spend $1 million to buy it from Nestle? Like, all of the things that I would worry about, like, can I make enough money to have a livable life? where am I spending that money? Am I spending it on buying bottled air, on buying bottled water? Am I spending it on air conditioning because some guy said that the solution to global warming was to move indoors and do everything indoors? Like, ultimately, it all comes back to the place we live, because that influences absolutely everything about our existence.
Yeah, and I mean, on top of that, like, you want to tackle systemic issues, specifically in the United States. Like, a lot of that stems from, like, areas right now that don't have clean water are, like, disproportionately people of color and things like that. Like, I think even if you want to start to tackle those systemic issues, you have to acknowledge the environmental issues of the planet that we live on, and for it to be livable for anybody, on top of trying to create equity among people.
So you've acknowledged that a lot of this is global, but you just brought up the United States, and certainly public policy at a national level is probably a pretty important part of making the planet livable and having good lives for everybody. So what if we had visiting in this class a candidate who was going to run for U.S. president in 2024? What would your advice be to that candidate? What do you need that candidate to put in his or her platform so that we can get to work on this?
My knee-jerk response is fire everyone on the Supreme Court. I know that's not realistic. But I feel like there's a dividing line between what can realistically be asked of a presidential candidate given the system that we have currently, and what I would ideally like to ask of someone in power. So, do you want the realistic answer, or do you want the idealistic answer?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think what I'd like to do is let's throw practicality and realism out the window, and let's go for the idealistic answer. Let's say we're living in some world where magically everybody might wake up from their stupor and elect somebody who had a really bold agenda. What is the right agenda? What really needs to be on that agenda?
I think really everything that we've been talking about in this room. I would probably vote for anyone in this room if they ran for president. But
who wants to do that?
I think they would get called crazy, unfortunately. I guess that's, I know you're saying idealistic, but I don't know. That seems so far-fetched at this point, like where we are. I just think there's too many people who never really learned about this, or, yeah, this probably seems like fantasy to a lot of people.
Yeah, maybe we need to start with firing everybody who's over 40. Get some new thinking in there, huh?
I think a strong willingness to acknowledge all of the flaws in our current systems and really just start fresh. Like, I think we've reached a point where it's going to be really hard to try and fix the structures that we have, and instead we need to think of a new way to do things. And to just have that willingness to just try and not start over totally, but just really rework the way that we do things and look at issues, and especially in our political system, like just the polarized nature, specifically talking about the U.S., like just a willingness to cooperate, like we were talking about, like create a community. I think it's hard to really create solutions if we're just fighting the whole time and arguing. Like, you're not going to come to solutions that way. So I think kind of overcoming those barriers and getting rid of the such polarized nature of people in the United States.
Does that resonate with you, Mikey? Because you're the most communist of all of us here.
Yeah, I just don't like the polarization of the U.S. I think a lot of other countries like Canada, they got the Conservative Party, Liberal Party, the Bloc Québécois, the yada, yada, yada. I don't know. I just think that there's never going to be any real sort of agreement between anyone with just, again, with, like I was talking about, generations. You got socialist communists, and then you got, like, diehard capitalists, and that's what our country is now, essentially. Is like, I mean, not in action, it's capitalist, right? But some younger people do have more communist, socialist sort of ideas. But yeah, I don't think our country can function how it is based on the two-party system. And
I'm just joking about the communist label. There are a lot of people who really have fear of that label, but let's just call it collaboration and cooperation and community, right? Which is what you're talking about. Alex, I see you nodding, but we haven't heard much from you.
Yeah, I feel like something that I've kept going back to is just what we talked about, I think, the first day of class, like the concept of like eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, and how like almost everybody in the room mentioned that, yeah, we do have anxiety about our future because of the climate. And I think just that kind of insecurity is where our focus is now, is just that we might not even be here, like our generations in the future might not even be here if we like continue on this trajectory. And I think that's really scary. And I think we're all just grasping at like what we can do now to like maybe even have a further chance for like the future of us.
Nathan, any thoughts?
I don't know, I just kind of think like the whole idea of how, like the two-party system kind of sucks. Like, I don't know, I feel like if we really want something to change, it's not possible because everyone's split and there's not really an opportunity for someone to like kind of break out and have a new idea because it doesn't agree with one of the two sides, and then it's like, okay, no one's gonna like agree with you.
Well, in our idealistic world, we could say, okay, we'll take the money out of politics, we'll get rid of the two-party system, we'll have ranked choice voting, that'll help with that probably. Let's really go for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Let's not let the difficulty of doing the right thing stop us from imagining what the right thing really looks like just for a few minutes.
Yeah, I think eradicating the two-party system is a really great step. I mean, there's other countries that have multiple parties and they have issues as well. But I think for the United States specifically, it is a really big issue that we're facing right now. The Electoral College is highly problematic. I think ranked choice voting is a great step in the right direction. And I think if a presidential candidate was sitting here today, I would tell them to resign. Because, I don't know, I think it's funny when we talk about, like, Joe Biden or Donald Trump or, like, when Obama was in office, and it's like they're one little tiny tier that we see as, like, the top of it all. But, like, especially with the media, and I hate to be like, oh, the media these days, but, like, the media these days is, like, putting the president, and I'm saying president in quotes because like president implies that they have so much power. They don't. Like the power they have is from the power that we're giving them with our tweets and with social media and with media coverage in general on the news. Like, I think it's flawed to even like see the president as like the beautiful, idyllic person with all this power that's going to solve our problems. Like, I don't know. I think that the president is, in most terms, whoever they are, just kind of ridiculous and like a front while all these other things are going on behind the scenes. They're not even behind the scenes though. We're fully aware of the power of lobbying and everything else. Like you said, the Supreme Court, I mean, we think that something is stable, like, I mean, everything that basically wasn't codified with Roe v. Wade, and then that was eradicated, and it just tore so much stability that all of these like movements that we've been working towards out from under us because it wasn't codified. And I mean, that's slightly a digression, but I'm just saying that the overall assumption that our Congress and our House of Representatives has any sort of like substantial leeway is kind of flawed thinking. I mean, they do have substantial leeway, but so do corporations and the media. And I wish us as voters had more substantial leeway.
A president alone cannot and will not change the system. So I think in terms of this idealistic standard, yes, just revamping the whole system, because trying to fix what we have, we've kind of tried that before, and it just comes back to the same sort of state capture, corporate corruption aspect. So finding a new way to make this community-based and not just a few people in power all butting heads. And I think also bringing up what you said earlier, the economy supposedly being a way to support people rather than people supporting the economy as if it was some separate living entity. I would like it if politics and politicians could focus like that. rather than viewing the government and the people as separate entities, they should be the same thing.
Yeah. I think you've led me to the keystone of the solution. We've just got to stage a revolution, don't we? So we will throw out the president and the Congress, and we will establish the new system. So what's going to be the goals of the new system? What are the key policies that we'll enact?
Just the distribution of wealth. You can't have all of this like focused money and power in these big corporations. My hope would be is that we're working for all of the people in the United States to be able to have that livable wage like we were talking about, and like just a good standard of living. And I just think you can't do that when you have 4 or 5 people with the majority of wealth.
Thanks for that, Julia. I see heads nodding. So that's financial security and equity, right?
Yeah.
If we had to come up with some shorthand, what else do we need?
There will need to be, obviously, some level of regulation, some level of leadership. My initial thought was make it illegal to be in politics if you're over the age of 60 or you have more than $2 million. Just, no, you're not allowed.
What should be the agenda? We've dethroned the powerful in this country, and we have some kind of a revolutionary force here. The citizens are coming together and redesigning the system. So what does the system look like?
Redefining what success means to people would be a great way to rebuild our system. I don't think you need, money is great for happiness, but I don't think you need it. I think you can be happy in a lot of different ways. And if people prioritize their happiness and the happiness of others around them with empathy, we wouldn't maybe buy into like consumerism and the economy or the 40-hour work week. Maybe we could do a 20-hour work week and have a great time the rest of the week. Yeah, I think community is at the heart of it all. I've seen and felt the most impactful when I'm working directly with my community. My goal in life is to give back to my community because it's given so much to me. So just getting like reciprocal relationships back, community back, would be my ideal society.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about localization and globalization, and we've become so money focused, and it seems like we won't, especially if you look at the policymakers today, the only policy that they're thinking about implementing is something that has some kind of price tag attached to it. They figure they're not going to get changes in behavior among all the citizens unless they're fining us or rewarding us financially. They don't think about what's the right thing to do. Let's just make sure everybody knows what the right thing to do is. I think you guys might all agree we sort of need to give up on globalization anyway because it's really causing a lot of our problems. And we need more localized economies. I think it would make it easier, wouldn't it, for us to value working together, sharing, cooperating, where you don't have to necessarily write a check to somebody. You can barter, you can exchange goods or help each other out.
Localization is really important, and I think it's important because I think that this is the general consensus that I hear from talking to people and young people in general, that we feel very powerless, and we've grown up in a system where you're supposed to look to people to power, and they're consistently disappointing. So I think stepping away from looking to somebody for power or with power, while I think leadership is essential, I don't think a leader is valuable unless they're considering the ideals of their entire community. And it's really hard to consider the ideals of the entire world because we have different cultures and isolated groups of people and just so much diversity on this planet. So yeah, I think leaders kind of stepping out of themselves, but kind of having that direction. Somebody needs to be like, hey, this is what we're doing. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. And when you're with your group of friends and you can't decide what you want to eat for dinner, somebody sometimes needs to be like, this is what we're doing. And then it's going to happen. But yeah, I think looking to the spaces around you where you do have control and some leeway, maybe not control in the story, but some leeway and some, actionable opportunity within your little bubble. Our bubble is the University of Denver, and looking at what we can do here can, I think, have a ripple effect on the overall Denver community and the overall community of Colorado, and then that gets bigger and bigger. So I think focusing on what you can do around you is empowering.
I think both are important, both local and global systems, because I think if you focus exclusively on the local, that's how you end up with situations where a neighboring community is suddenly filled with somebody else's garbage because they were thinking only about their community and, okay, it's outside our borders, it's not our problem. Even though globalization, we think of things like outsourcing labor, the reason we're outsourcing labor is because it's cheap and we don't care about the people way over there.
And we're outsourcing our pollution.
Yeah, we're outsourcing everything.
Because we don't care.
So yes, it's important to realize that you don't have perfect information and you don't have influence everywhere. So you should focus your influence in places you have knowledge of, but recognizing that you are not an isolated system. It all comes back to that idea of community and trust. You have to trust that the other communities around you won't screw you over. And then you have to bring to the table also not screwing over everyone else.
And someone has to go first, don't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I appreciate that addition to what I was talking about with localization, Jordy. That's it's a good point.
Do you have a question for me, or do you have something that you think we've left off the table that we ought to talk about?
Can we, as a group, go back to reframing what we're not calling the American dream, but like the human dream? I think it would maybe be interesting if we all went around. I mean, some people touched on little bits of it, but maybe if we all went around and said just a couple things that are a part of the human dream to like bring back that collective thinking.
Yeah, I think I liked when we talked about the meaning of the pursuit of happiness and that being the American dream and how not everyone actually has the ability for the pursuit of happiness. So I think if we could level the playing field and give everybody the resources to actually have the pursuit of happiness, I think that would be, the ultimate goal.
And is that some basic level of needs met?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, basic levels of needs met, and also, I don't know, maybe like leveling the playing field with education too. And I think all public schools should have the same amount of funding, and maybe all schools should be learning about this a little bit, from a young age, and implementing composting and recycling would also be cool. But
yeah, and I think that there's always going to be so much variation between wealth, but I do believe that no person should ever obviously be homeless. Everyone needs a basic living. Everyone needs food, water. Everyone needs to be able to get along decently. I believe that there's always going to be variation. There's always going to be super wealthy people, but then obviously we just don't want to get to the point of homelessness or where you don't get those necessities.
It's a sad reality that we have to talk about fighting for people to have basic needs. Like, to think that there's so many people that you would have to help just for, like, clothing, a home, and food. Like, I don't know. I think that's a sad, low bar. I think I would hope that we would eventually, in an idealist society, get to a point where everyone is not stressing for basic needs. Like, yes, they have it, and also are able to support themselves and not just be fighting for those basic needs, if that makes sense. I don't know. I think I would hope that we could strive for more than that. But like I said, there is such a large portion of people today that don't have access to those things.
Is more charity what's needed, or is there something else that more equity, level playing field would be a big part of it? But I'm wondering if just more charity is also a part of it, or if it's something else that needs to be fixed.
I think it's kind of back to what I was talking about with compassion and empathy. I think with the individualist ideas, it's turned into such of a demonizing other people and seeing them as your competition and having to fight against one another. I think we need to move away from that and be able, I don't know, I keep going back to it, just acknowledge that other people need help and you also need help, and just that everybody is experiencing the human existence and not seeing other people on the planet as a bad thing, but more as like we can work together to solve these issues type ideas.
I don't remember the exact number, but someone did the math, and Jeff Bezos could buy every individual person, not just families, every individual homeless person in America a house that already exists and lose not even double-digit percentage of his current wealth.
Wow.
It's like 3 days of his earnings. So I definitely agree with the, like, it's about being able to care about other people. Ultimately, it comes back to equity, I think, where you've got this system that is designed around exploitation and mistrust. But if you look even like way back, paleontology, looking at what we as people define as the first signs of civilization, quote unquote, is evidence of taking care of people who were unable to take care of themselves. You see evidence of, okay, this is an ancient humanoid, and they were clearly taken care of because you can tell by their skeletal structure they were old or infirm, or they broke a bone that any individual animal would not have survived, but clearly there's evidence that it's healed and they were taken care of. And so when you have people who think that, it comes back to that bootstrap theory, that if you're poor, it's because you chose to be poor. It's because you made bad decisions and you're not my responsibility. But then you look at places like Finland, like Sweden, like Norway, where they have, either on large or small scales, introduced this idea of social welfare. And it's been statistically proven that when people are not worrying about dying, the vast majority of people choose to work. They choose to contribute to society. Like, the vast majority of them. And those who don't usually are either elderly, young, disabled, and I think it comes back to, why are you valuing a person based off what they can give to you, what they can give to the economy, and not simply because they are a person that exists that you should care about.
Okay, so we're attempting to make sure that we've defined the human dream adequately, and we've got collaboration, community, needs met, value of the individual. What else? Is there more to it?
I think we've covered a lot of like the really great foundations, and then just a little bit above that, not more important, but just another layer. I hate to be like, freedom is so important, because the definition of freedom is also flawed, but I think freedom of expression is really important. I think when they're given the foundations of food and water and housing, they kind of can like sit back and then have some mental space to express what they're experiencing. And I think art is a really amazing outlet, and not just like visual art, but speaking can be a form of art, and dance and music and visual art and all of those things that really like set us apart from other species on this planet is something that I think can be very indicative of a thriving community, when people have an outlet to express how they feel, to express what they're thinking, to express their pain. When they're given resources to get that out of them, I think they're less likely to engage in unhealthy coping mechanisms, like using substances or engaging in self-harm or engaging in violence. Like I think all of that comes from pent-up inability to express. So I think these types of conversations, art, those freedoms for people to get that shit out of them. Yeah, I think that's really important for people to feel like a relief, and like just the ability to get up every day, or something to look forward to, to be able to share what they're experiencing.
Okay, one last assignment I want to suggest for our revolutionary roundtable. I'm going to propose that our primary moral imperative is to leave a planet where the next generation can achieve the human dream. where they have a chance to live just a basic, decent life. So that means we're not leaving them a dead planet. So let's say one of our goals needs to be no dead planet in 50 years. So do we need to have on our agenda that we're going to shrink our economy and shrink our population? Are those a couple of key top-level items, or are those not important issues?
I think they are important issues, but I think if we value the community in the way that we're discussing, those are going to be ripple effects, because the economy and what we're doing with everything, it's just we're trying to add in more things to give us happiness that we think are going to give us happiness. But if we really feel fulfilled and safe and happy with what we have in the present, we're not going to buy the next trinket. We're not going to do all of that. And if we truly have adequate healthcare, human rights, I really think that, population and all of these other issues are going to level out. So yeah, I think those are just going to be ripple effects if we really do value what we have and place value on community more.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, good notion. Might take a while.
Yeah, no, it'll be forever. You might never see it, but
I think if we're not starting with our little idealized society here, those are two more important aspects to kind of bring to the attention of the general public. If we couldn't, start over like we were just talking about, but going from what we actually have today, I think bringing to the attention and educating people about our economic system and kind of the sense of our class that right now, not many people get this perspective that the traditional economic system that we have and that people are taught is not the only way, and it's not the correct way in a sense, Education in that sense is a good step that we can do now.
Yeah.
In terms of trying to kind of revamp society and change these smaller things, if we can reconnect the concept of economy with human welfare, I think inevitably those two things will bind together and correlate. So if overpopulation becomes an issue that we want to solve and economy is correlated to that, automatically you have this, there aren't as many people that need to be supported, so the economy does not need to be as large.
Yeah.
So they don't need to necessarily be tackled as separate issues. They just need to be recognized as kind of fundamentally the same thing.
And then we just need to step out of the crazy notions that we've gotten ourselves into, where we just assume they've got to grow and that they can grow forever, huh?
I love the Yogi Berra quote that says, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And I think this ties into the challenge that David laid down. We are not happy with where we are right now. And Dan Gilbert and our ability to envision the future and envision liver and onion flavored ice cream and not having to make it. So as we envision the trajectory that we're going on, we decide we do have to identify where we want to get to. And, I've been a command and control guy. We actually have to get to 2 billion or 3 billion to truly achieve sustainability and have a material level of well-being that we would find acceptable. I'm listening to you guys, and there's this discomfort and this need for leeway and freedom, and there's this sense that if we fix those things, that the co-benefits will naturally manifest as a smaller economy, a decreasing population. I'm not sure if that's true. I have to admit, when we brought Nandita Bahaj here, she kind of opened my eyes to the idea that if we just let women have what they want with respect to maternal health care, access to birth control, etc., the population problem does start to take care of itself. It really does. You don't need coercive antenatal policy. The coercive pronatal policies that are in place now are stronger. And so I'm kind of getting this idea that maybe you guys are right. Maybe the problems that I thought were the biggest, which was overpopulation and a growth imperative embedded into capitalism, take care of themselves if we take care of some of these community squishy things you guys are talking about around this table. But I still think Yogi Berra was right. You got to know where you're going. And I think scientists have a lot to say and contribute. We probably need to engage in degrowth. And how we get there, I'm not sure. So I'm just kind of wallowing in the good vibes here and thinking that maybe my ideas of how we need to get to where I think we need to be might not be what I think they are. I could throw out as a final challenge, the University of Denver is happy to take your tuition dollars and promise you a better future. Simultaneously, they have tens of millions of dollars in their endowment invested in fossil fuels.
Boo.
Is that okay? And is that part of the solution where we solve the problems we've been talking about? And what do you do about that? Just curious.
As a generation, we have been so incredibly powerless that thinking in this idealistic scenario, we're giving ourselves back that power. So with the example of DU, that's where I think we need to have the objective viewpoint of large scale, where do we want to end up? What are the scientific reasons and motivations for getting where we want to go? And then the subjective, what are we as students who care going to do to change that system? Because the subjectivity also comes back in, how do you get someone to care about other people, and in what way? How do you get the chancellor to care about the promises that are being made to students and then putting money in fossil fuels? Where does that come from? Because we've had science telling us all these things for how many decades, and that objectivity to a point hasn't worked. So where does the subjective individual push come from?
I think you guys have defined the operating system that we need. We need to decide, is it Windows, is it Mac OS, is it Linux, is it pursuit of growth, is it selfishness, is it individualism? You've described the operating system that would, if we could adopt it as a society, that the apps that would be written would address the problems and solve the problems that we have. I worry that we don't have a lot of time. So I think it's good to define the operating system, but I think we also need to get busy coming up with what are the apps and what do we need them to do. Also, that we need to give society the pushes that it needs, certainly the leadership. I think that was probably the headline of this conversation for me, is that your notion that we need good leadership. That doesn't necessarily we need the right president or the right elected officials in Washington, D.C., but we need leadership somehow that's going to inspire us to do the right thing.
I think one thing that we've all touched on but haven't explicitly stated is education. I think educating children, below the ages of 18 about objective science, like what you talked about, carrying capacity and equilibrium. I mean, I hated chemistry when I was in middle school and high school because it was taught in a horrible way. But I think getting kids from a really early age to think about a lot of the things we've touched on, empathy and compassion, which is certainly not a focus in public schools today, unfortunately, and getting kids to think about science in an interesting way, getting kids, inspired to look at the world as outside of themselves and taking less of a focus on humanity being the best species or something, getting children to appreciate nature and appreciate each other and appreciate their capacity to express themselves, I think is really revolutionary and inspiring. Empowering children with knowledge and empowering children with community from a young age is really essential. I mean, just looking at a tree and being able to see how complex it is compared to yourself, rather than seeing, ourselves as the most complex aspect to the whole world. Having that information is really empowering for appreciating our environment and maybe taking better care of it.
One thing I like to have in this podcast is your sense of the future, what you're optimistic about and what you're pessimistic about. If we could just go around the table and just hear from everybody.
Okay. I think I am very optimistic for the future, with the people in this room right now. But I am a little bit scared for like everybody or a lot of people who are outside of the room just on like their views of like the world and the economy and like human rights and everything is just really scary how it like conflicts with the environment and like if we are going to leave a dead world. But I do feel very optimistic with what everybody has said in the room about our value of the community and the world. And yeah.
I'll start with something pessimistic, and this is just kind of emotional, I guess. I'm just scared that a lot of people are going to suffer. I know a lot of people are suffering right now, but I'm very scared for a lot of suffering for myself, the people I love, and the entire world, and the environment, because I think it's inevitable. But I think I'm optimistic because I think so much growth can come from suffering, and I think so much change can come from suffering, and I wish that we didn't have to endure suffering for change to occur, but I think that sometimes people connect on a deeper level when they recognize that everyone is experiencing the same pain that they are. So I think that if people, can come to that low point, that maybe we can, go from the deep end somewhere greater together through bonding over that shared experience.
I think I'm actually in much the same boat as you. I'm a naturally pessimistic person, and I don't remember the exact quote, but I read something along the lines of everyone expects the apocalypse to be one singular event that hits everyone all at once, but for a lot of people around the world, the apocalypse has already happened. It's happening. It will continue to happen. And just because it hasn't hit you yet doesn't mean that it's not there. And looking at history, kind of like you said, it seems that the most significant changes come after really terrible things. So I have my fingers crossed that we'll be able to make some good from it in the end. If I cannot believe in a world that I want to live in, what's the point?
I'm going to be a little more optimistic. I think we're very close. I think we are very close to what you're referring to as the apocalypse, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But we have so little time to pull back from it. And I'm talking like the next 10, 20 years. This is just my feeling, my opinion. I'm very pessimistic about anyone agreeing with each other on anything. But I am, after the last thing I said, this isn't going to make any sense, but I'm optimistic that there's going to be some big breakthrough, whether people agree on it or not. I think someone's going to be in power that's going to push some kind of policy or something that is going to encourage new things to happen. I know it's very vague, but that's how I feel personally.
Yeah, I just think there's obviously a lot to do, but I'm pretty optimistic about it. But I don't know, I feel like a lot of it just starts with educating people when they're young, with the whole about the environment, about everything that's wrong and what needs to happen. And so I feel like if you start educating people younger about this stuff, then they'll kind of choose paths in their lives that lead to making a change and that kind of thing. And so yeah, I'm just kind of optimistic about that.
I would say I'm a little bit pessimistic in the sense that we're probably going to lose a lot of our natural world, and that's really sad, and that the next generation isn't going to be able to fully even understand potentially what I don't know, in the future kids might look back at history textbooks and see pictures of the natural world but never be able to experience that and never be able to know what I don't know, the cleanest version of our world was actually like. But I am a little bit optimistic in the sense that I am really excited to graduate and go into the workforce and be a part of the solution and be able to say that I did something, even if it's the smallest thing, smallest ripple effect, to try to talk to people on the other side and maybe not completely change their mind, but have them have a little bit more sense of compassion for like our side of things. And yeah, I don't know. I don't see people's political views maybe changing drastically in the near future, but I definitely see an expansion of our thoughts in many different ways in social media and just conversations with friends and in some leaders. But hoping that we'll have an exponential growth and lead to positive change. I don't know.
I would say I tend to have a pessimistic point of view. I don't know, especially in the sense where we were talking about our idealist society, and like I just really can't picture that ever being a reality. And in the sense that I kind of agree with Elsa, that I think unfortunately once we do accept that we need change, it might be too late. But also in the sense of optimism, I like to imagine that there are more people taking classes like the one we're in. There's more people having these conversations like the one that we're having in today's society, and that I like to hope that maybe as a collective, us that are talking about this now can eventually push for that change maybe a little sooner before a lot of the suffering happens, is what I would like to hope for.
I'm also pretty pessimistic. It's hard not to be, especially as an environmental science major, learning about this all the time. But I'm in control of myself, and I'm going to do everything that I can with education and advocating and researching to leave the best impact that I can, and hope that everyone else can do the same in their own way, whatever that is.
Well, I'd like to leave you all in charge, that's for sure. Soon. Thank you very much. Thanks very much to students Lilia Davis, Julia Gainey, Cassianne Liv, Nathan Cox, Mikey Ford, Jordy Schonk, Elsa Krantz, and Alex Vandewater, and to Professor Paul Sutton, all at the University of Denver, for this enlightening discussion. Because that conversation was fairly long and we wanted to include as much as possible of it, we're not doing all of our usual features like growth-busting news and Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint and listener feedback. We'll get back to those features in the next episode of the Growth Busters podcast, which is coming up very soon, and that'll be Overpopulation Think Tank Part 2 with Nanda Debajaj, Sarah Bexell, and Paul Sutton. So we're just going to have a brief conversation to debrief on what these young 20-year-olds have to say about getting out of that hole. So what did you think, Steph?
Well, I thought that this group of students seemed a lot more enlightened, perhaps, than the group last year. And I think that might be related to just all of the terrible climate news that we keep getting more and more frequently. So maybe that's a contribution. But I found this group of students to just be very aware, very tuned in to a lot of the things that we actually talk about on this podcast, right? The eco-anxiety. And then, obviously Paul Sutton's done a great job of introducing them to a lot of topics as well. But yeah, I was impressed.
Yeah, I think it's getting harder and harder to be ignorant or in denial of this situation that we're in. I thought it was also interesting there wasn't a denier in the bunch. Or
if there was, they were too afraid to speak up. But hopefully we got to hear from pretty much everyone, right? Was anyone just holding back, you think, or?
Well, we did hear from everyone, but there were a couple people who dominated the conversation, and Elsa was certainly a star. I was really glad to allow her to dominate the conversation because she was really thoughtful. But there were a couple of people who participated less, but the sense I got just from the body language and facial expressions and what little they did say was that there wasn't anyone who I think was reading Ayn Rand and a member of the American Enterprise Institute or the Club for Growth.
Yep. Well, I loved the discussion you had about the American dream. I think that is a really interesting topic, both for people like in our generations. I'm one generation under you, obviously, but people in our generations, what was our idea of the American dream? And then what is the American dream for today's people in their early 20s?
Were you surprised?
That was shocking, yeah.
That American dream that I tried to describe to them, that was news to them. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your generation was aware that you were getting screwed out of that dream. And this generation has no idea that dream ever existed.
Yeah, but I think even in last year's conversation, the students were talking about going out and getting the best job they can get.
True.
And this year they were talking not about that, intentionally not about that. They were more focused on quality of life and relationships and not quantity of material wealth.
Yeah, to a large degree. Yeah, I didn't get the sense any of them expected to make a lot of money. I didn't get the sense that was even important to a lot of them.
Yeah.
Having some financial security, that's still there, but just, basic needs met, which is really where we need to be.
Absolutely. And then the conversation about politics was pretty disheartening, I think, just everyone's recognition that the current state of affairs is so dysfunctional. But I also found them to just be very enlightened about the fact that there's all of these different power structures at play with lobbying and the media, and that idea of trust in institutions is really low because our government can't do anything, can't get anything accomplished, and they're being controlled by the puppeteers of industry.
Yeah, and I think that might be why I did not get from them one thing that I kind of hoped to get, which was kind of a list of practical, maybe semi-practical steps, some concrete things that we really needed to accomplish. And they really tended to focus on what I described, I think accurately, was kind of the operating system, the kind of the foundational principles, things like collaboration, cooperation, community. Those are the things that we need to have that will help us to put in place the fixes that we need to do. But they had a hard time, I think, thinking about the fixes just because they've kind of gotten used to being powerless, or thinking they're powerless anyway.
Well, and I think to their credit, the fixes require a completely new way of thinking about everything, a completely new system. And I loved their recognition that the current system is what is causing all of these problems. Individuals in poverty, incarcerated, drug addicted. It's not the individual's fault. It's not like these individuals want to end up like that, but the system creates the secret sauce that forces a lot of people into that.
Yeah.
So I just really appreciated their recognition that it's a systemic thing and it's not like we need to be blaming individuals.
Yeah, fair enough.
So how do we get that fundamental culture changed? What they were describing as investment in community and community investing in individuals, and there being a symbiotic relationship there. And it seemed like you all landed on maybe like a grassroots revolution is going to be needed. Just completely start over.
I think the revolution is needed to at least get the more practical things into play, but the basic foundations of the culture, the philosophy, and the belief system, I'm not sure if that can change in a revolutionary way. Let's hope it can, because we need it to change fast. But typically that kind of thing, I think, evolves. But I think their comments are evidence that evolution is certainly underway.
Oh, yeah. If that's the way our today's youth thinks, then I think that bodes well. If they can manifest that culture shift as they become, members participating in society, then maybe there is hope.
Yeah. Anything else?
Well, how can we skip that emotional ending? I mean, I found that to be really powerful. You can really hear how scared these students are, how sad they are, that even though they see this really hard road ahead for them, and they're all highly privileged relative to the global population, if they see these things barreling down toward them and recognizing that a lot of people on the planet don't even have the basic needs met and are already experiencing an apocalypse. I mean, that's just kind of tragic to have that level of awareness at that age. But I found them to be extremely wise. And I can't remember if it was Elsa's comment where she said that learning comes from suffering. And so if we are headed toward this rock bottom, then maybe out of that, there can be a rebirth of a new way of life, a new way of doing things, and rebuilding for the better. So hard ending,
yeah.
Hard ending, honestly.
We all hate to have to learn things the hard way.
Yeah.
But sometimes you do. And yet, in spite of their being pretty well aware of how dire our situation is, You know, I don't think there was anyone there who didn't articulate some degree of optimism about the future. Maybe it's a flaw, or maybe it's a really important characteristic of the human condition. That's why I'm here. It looks bleak, but I'm not giving up.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But wow, what a great opportunity. Really awesome that Paul keeps inviting you back, and that these students are willing to open up and share their ideas and thoughts for our listeners. So very grateful to this set of students.
We didn't share any listener feedback in this episode in order to keep the length down, but we normally do, and we'd really like to hear your thoughts about what you've just heard. So call the Growthbusters hotline and leave a message that we can play on the next episode. Call now. Operators are standing by. 719-402-1400. That's 719-402-1400. Stephanie, before we go, I said we weren't going to do any of the normal extra features, but I am going to toss in one real quick thing just because it is so timely. U.S. President Joe Biden's on a plane on his way back to the United States from a meeting of the G7. And I just happened to notice in my feed this morning that the G7 issued a statement called the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan. And I read some of it, skimmed the rest of it, and just made note of the fact that there were 3 mentions of sustainable growth and one of green growth. And it was nothing about going on an energy diet, nothing about shrinking the economy, nothing about adjusting our lifestyles in the overdeveloped world to live more simply. It's totally all technology, the hope that clean energy technology is going to solve the climate crisis and get us to net zero emissions by 2050. Continuing disappointment there.
Yep. Womp womp.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up.
Yeah. Having intelligent conversations about overshoot is so important. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share with the people you love or anyone who needs to learn about limits to growth. This could be your mayor, your governor, your senator, prime minister, President Joe Biden, for example, or any journalists.
Yeah, and follow the podcast on your podcast app so that you don't miss an episode.
Consider joining our online community at groups.io. If you search Growthbusters on groups.io, come join the conversation there.
Yeah, there's some great stuff going on there. And I really want to thank Cenk Fader for writing and producing the Growthbusters theme song that you hear at the open and close of this podcast. And I want to thank Carlos Jones for singing it.
Go to growthbusters.org to learn more about the issues we discuss in this podcast.
And also to donate or get on our email list. 2 important things to do. This is a nonprofit project, and we depend on your participation in that.
Well, if the hole doesn't cave in on us first, we'll see you next time.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some they just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.